All right, so I think we're going to get started. Thank you. All right, hi everyone. Welcome to Here and Now. This is Square WomEng's semi-annual Tech Talk. We've been doing this event for about 2 years. It started off just being open to women engineers, but we've since opened it up to other marginalized groups just to get more voices out there presenting in tech. The structure of the event is going to be 6 tech talks, 10 to 12 minutes each, and then after we're going to have a Q&A with all the speakers. So to start us off, we have Sarah Harvey from Square's mobile security team.
Did you want to do the speaker lineup here?
Yeah. So our speakers, first we have Sarah Harvey, then we have Sudhaka Golba, then we have Dana Bauer, Natalie Judd, Alivia Blount, and Matthew Jacobs. Woo!
Hi, so my talk today is titled Making Use of Visualization to Understand Traffic and Data Flow. Basically, why have this talk? This kind of, a bit of background is I used to be on the security infrastructure team, so I was very much interested in understanding how the infrastructure here at Square works. So think about your organization and how your team is structured right now. A bit of a disclaimer, this is probably going to be more of a back-end server / infrastructure engineering oriented talk, and I'll try my best to explain those concepts. So let's think about how your team or how your organization is set up right now. You probably have a service or several services that you're maintaining. And if it's not a service, maybe it's some kind of product. One thing to think about is where is the data stored for that particular service? It probably is in some kind of database of some kind. But then you have a question of like what kind of data is actually stored in that database? Is it important data? Is it not very important data, rather? Is it some information, some like metadata information, like stuff that's like for a catalog or just a list of events or something like that? Or maybe it's semi-sensitive data, like names and email addresses and phone numbers and personal location. Or it could be ultra-sensitive data, like credit card and bank information. And maybe there are some rules governing how that data in that service is particularly stored. So you have to follow checklists and compliance. So question, do you share that data? Maybe it's to another service in your org. Maybe you have a microservice architecture at your current organization. You have a bunch of different services. Maybe that you're actually sharing not to just one service, but to 3 services. Maybe those services share that data elsewhere. Maybe one of those services shares that data that you have to an external partner. And so now you're probably thinking, this is kind of getting a little bit scary as you're wondering about where is your data actually stored, what parts of it might be sensitive, and where could it be traveling in your organization? What other teams are potentially using that data? What other vendors, external vendors are using that data? Why are they using it? There's all of these questions that maybe you didn't consider. So you might be sitting in the audience right now thinking, well, my organization doesn't have that problem. We document stuff. That's cool. At Square, we also document stuff, or try to. We have design documents that need to be reviewed every time we design a new service or feature or product. And it not only goes through a design review across various teams in engineering, I'm on the InfoSec team, so it generally has an InfoSec component or review component as well. But now there's a new question of, well, now you have all of these design docs, and you can get inundated with information from all of these. So when you're trying to understand where the data is flowing through your service, you now have to read hundreds of design docs. Say you have hundreds of services at your org, now you have hundreds of design docs. And you can probably multiply that more because every time you add a new feature to your service, you're probably writing a new You're probably writing a new design doc. The other problem with this is that it's actually hard to piece together your overall architecture from all of these different design docs because you're basically being given hundreds of small windows into those services' inner workings. But you might say, oh, but we have compliance regulations, and we have a vendor security policy that define exactly what data can enter and exit different teams or the company or your infrastructure, and that's great and all. But that probably only likely defines the thin surface of the data situation of your organization. And so questions about how the different services integrate with each other with that data is part of the deeper unknown. So that's why I have a picture of an iceberg. It's like you don't know what's underneath the surface there. So I propose that the best way to get a handle on your data story is to create a visualization of your data flow at your org. And then you might respond back with, but this is just going to be another document. And you just said that documents go out of date. Well, what if I told you that you could do this kind of visualization in real time with data you probably already have, and it would look cool at the end of it. So that's basically what we did at Square. We just used logs, this thing, which is just logs, and we ended up creating this, which is a cool kind of view into, is a real-time view into what the state of service-to-service communication is at Square. So you might be asking, well, how did you do this? Like, how did you go from just having logs to producing a really cool visualization? There is a little, so like the TLDR is, okay, all of our services right now emit logs into a Kafka instance. And from there, we simply consume from Kafka in real time to parse out the messages we need detailing who is making a request to who. So basically, log information comes from services, go into this big giant data pipe, and then they come out into this little small service that parses all of the information and produces this nice, really nice visualization. I can't actually take credit for making this visualization because I'm not a really cool UI designer or engineer. I'm actually a server or backend engineer. The people who actually built this visualization software or front end are the people at Netflix who created this tool called Visceral, Vizceral, just to keep in mind. So we basically make, one of the things that's really cool here at Square is we have an access control mechanism between all of our services. So each service acts as a client and a server at the same time. They identify they self-identify to each other whenever they perform any kind of RPC call. And we can have services self-report when they're accessed by various clients. So, service A tries to talk to service B and says, I want some kind of interesting blob, and B reports to Kafka, hey, A made a request called get interesting blob for me, just FYI. So that was kind of easy, maybe. It might be a little bit more involved if you are starting from scratch. Square is a larger organization now. We have just over 2,000 employees, and we have a rather large engineering team. Maybe you're at a smaller company and you're thinking, well, we're at a stage where things are starting to get a little bit out of control. How do we corral all of this kind of data questions and information from the start? So I've put some key points. So I'm someone from InfoSec, obviously. Enforce access control and self-identification between your services so that your services know who they're talking to. This is also just good security practice. Start emitting logs or metrics for each request made between the services. This is just a good idea overall because you can get a lot of insight in terms of how well your service is performing, whether there's latency creeping up or whether your QPS is suddenly going high. It would be nice if you could use a unified format of data transfer. So at Square, we use protobufs for our RPCs. And then having tagged fields so you can tag so that you can see these email addresses are being sent from here to here, or phone numbers are being sent here to here because it's actually labeled in the field or in the protobuf. We utilize a unique trace ID in order to track each end-to-end request. So anytime we get a request coming in from the website, for example, we can see the full path of how it's traversing through the organization. And then I mentioned use Visceral from Netflix to visualize this cool graph. You can go advanced mode. If you have the capability, you can start trying to sample network traffic to see what other things are communicating in your infrastructure, in your network, besides just the service-to-service stuff. So things that you might not consider talking to each other, just like other network services. Maybe there's like people using SSH everywhere, tracking that. You can also sample external requests to see the rate of your data infiltration and exfiltration. I always think this is a very interesting question. Just how much data is entering your org, and also how much data are you giving away to everyone else? And if there's some concrete way to be able to measure that, then you can just say, you can be able to do proper risk models by understanding like, oh, I'm sending all of this data to all of these people and they have this particular risk structure or risk or threat model. And then you can also start identifying points of interest. Maybe there are hot paths that you really care about. So one of the hot paths at Square that we really care about is the payments hot path. The idea being that if anything in the payments hot path goes down, then payments don't work, and well, Square is in not a great situation. Other things might be hot nodes. What I call hot nodes are services or pieces of data that are interesting. So at Square, we have dedicated services storing a bank account and credit card information. So we want to know what other services are talking to that particular service, because maybe they're not supposed to, and maybe we need to like actually call our access list for those kinds of services. And then you can go super advanced mode and then use something like Neo4j, which is basically a graph database to answer more interesting questions like, say at Square we have on the order of hundreds of services. And so tracing through even a visualization might be very difficult to answer just basic questions. But using Neo4j, you can just write a query and say, where are all the email addresses stored? Where are all of the names stored? Where are all the credit cards stored? And stuff like that. You can also start do queries like, what are all of the related paths that might be on that might be near the hot paths that I care about? Like, for example, the payments hot path. Do those services have a chance to influence the hot path in some way? There are also some side benefits to being able to do this kind of visualization. You end up, number one, all of the engineers then realize, hey, we now have this cool graph. Now we have a lot better insight and visualization into like how our infrastructure actually works. We understand what talks to what. We understand like why these services interact with each other. But you can also use it as a tool for diagnosis and better diagnosis and better debugging, especially during various kinds of incidents. I'm sure all of us have run into a situation where some service or some feature or something at your company goes down and you're like, well, everything is broken. What do I do? How do I fix it? Why is everything going wrong? How do we get this org or the infrastructure back up on our feet? So questions like, is my QPS unusually high? This is an actual question we ended up answering where we built a new service and we noticed in this graph that I built that it was sending like over 100 QPS to this other service when it didn't need to. It only needed to send 5 QPS and it sent like over 100. So we were able to fix that bug. You can answer questions like, is there a thundering herd of requests starting to approach my service? Say like something in the hot path has gone down and now you are worried about when it comes back up, are all of the requests going to come in at once and take it back down again? Can we visualize a failover? I think the idea of being able to visualize a failover for those of you who may not understand is if you're in a situation where you're in multiple regions, you have services in like US East, US West, Europe, etc., and you want to fail all the traffic for your services from one data center or one region to another, being able to visualize this failover, I think, is very important because then you can actually isolate the fact that, oh, there's no more traffic happening in that data center, everything is fine. Versus, you still see some additional traffic like, oh crap, something's not going to work. And the final question, being security-minded, that I think might be kind of interesting is being able to answer like, are we being DDoSed? Like the internet is a messy place. There's a lot of junk on there. People love trying to take down bigger companies when they don't, I have a password field here. Continuing on, people will try and send junk traffic to your service to try and take it down. And being able to visualize where it's coming from, why it's coming from, what the type of traffic it is in order to figure out how to block it, I think is really, really important. So with that said, I'll just pull this slide up. Trust me, this is cool. Unfortunately, I don't have an animation here, but like the dots can move around and stuff, and then sometimes you see red dots, which means there's failed requests, and there are yellow dots that mean that, you know, oh, there could be like there's a warning that was emitted, but this is cool. You should do this. That's all I have. Thanks for listening. Up next, we have Sughara.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks to the Square team. My name is Sukhada, and I'm a co-founder at Curio. And I'm here to talk about the things that I've learned from starting my own company. What problem are we trying to solve at Curio? Is it something as complicated as like content computing? Is it artificial intelligence or like rocketry? Well, not really. We're doing antiques. Yeah. So the story starts with my co-founder, Samantha, and her love for antiques. And like when you put these two things together, it's like a perfect recipe for financial burden. Yeah. So much so that I had to like step in and ask her to stop spending less. So kind of faced with this problem of how does she spend less but continue her passion for antiques. So she decided to document her 600 odd items that she had collected over 7 years. And she started with a really simple solution that is spreadsheets. And then kind of having played with that a little bit, she kind of moved on to a desktop database product. And again, like playing with that and kind of realizing the limitations of the tool, she was kind of pushed into developing something herself. She didn't really want to like develop a system from like scratch because her day job, she's a developer. But she really wanted to like continue like documenting her stuff. And so that's where like we learned one of the most important lessons is like for startups and companies, like iterate like voting, you know, like early and often. I know we're not in Chicago, but I think this tenet holds true for like everyone. So having started with a spreadsheet and then like a desktop database, and then we moved to like a home server actually. And these were all like pre-company solutions. So we kind of went through these 3 iterations. And during this time, like all this while I was watching her, like she was doing this wonderful job of like documenting her collection, and she was like connecting her items with the designers and the companies that made them. And like she built this cool tool like unintentionally. She didn't really want to do it, but she was solving a problem for like herself. And it turned out to be really beautiful and elegant. And I was like, I think we have something here. And I think you should release this to everyone. And her instant reaction was like, absolutely not. Like, I'm not going to do that. That's not what I want to do. She just wanted to solve a problem for herself. So it took a lot of convincing, actually, quite a few months. And then we decided, like, okay, I think we're going to do this. And that's when, like, so from the home server, we had to move to a hosting service now. And things were kind of moving along. The development was going along okay. And I remember we were standing, and I like asked her, how many people do you think this thing can host? And she was like, I think like 400 users. And I'm like, throw it out of the window. Like, that's never going to scale. Like, what can we do with that? And then she was like, oh God, let me see what I can do. She didn't really want to like, move in the direction that we were moving. So that's when we realized that I think we had to move to the cloud. So we decided like we were going to go with AWS. And this next part, I don't think she really wanted me to tell you guys, but so we decided to move to AWS. Neither one of us had any experience with like AWS. So that's her in a tub. So we were so dedicated, and I wanted to tell you guys how dedicated she was, that even while she was taking a bath, she would actually sit and watch like AWS tutorials. I'm not kidding. This is true. And like read up on all this material to kind of implement our cloud infrastructure. And so this brings me to our next point. That is, what do you do when you face complex challenges? Like, you have to get creative. I remember in the early days of our startup, so we cold called a law firm. We found them on the internet. They had great reviews. I think now that I look back, I don't think we would have ever called them if we knew who we were calling. So we were trying to convince them to take us on. They're a startup law firm. And so we didn't realize this 1 hour long conversation where we were trying to convince them, but they were kind of interviewing us to see if we were like, we're the right match for them. And so we've been partnering with them, and they've been great. And they have a look at our website, and they come back, and they're like, well, you can't use any of your designer portraits or the company logos for copyright issues. And we were like, well, we can't really go live without all that stuff. So that was a really interesting challenge, because we really wanted our site to be visually stimulating, and we couldn't use most of our content. So we decided like we were going to paint all the designers from scratch and all the company logos. We found a designer in India. Interestingly, he's a wonderful painter, but he had never really come across any mid-century antiques. Like, that's the era we like to collect. So most of our content was from that era. And so it was really interesting to kind of guide him and kind of, help him with what the designers should look like, what the company logo should be. So it turned out to be kind of an edge for us, because like he kind of had his own vision. He had never seen any of this stuff. So I think it turned out to be really great for us overall. So that brings me to my final thoughts. That is, I think a startup can be anything. It doesn't really have to be something complex. It could be something simple as like antiques in our case. It could even be something as simple as like delaying a notification or like a tweet. Like, that's what Buffer does. Like, I never thought that could be a startup. So it could be anything simple. Like, you can start by solving a problem for yourself and like just take it ahead. And then the next important lesson that we learned was like iterate early and often. Like, you can never be too early. So Reid Hoffman has this quote that if you're not embarrassed by your first prototype, you're already too late. Yeah, like, trust me, just yeah. So as early and as often as you can. And another important lesson was like, when you're challenged, like, try and get creative. I know it's easy to get bogged down, but if you just look at it from a different perspective, like, I think you would surprise yourself like how creative you would get. So thank you so much for having me here. And if you guys have any questions, like please let me know. And you can email me sukhada@curio.com. I would be happy to help. It's going to be Dana next.
Hi, I'm Dana Bauer, and I'm going to talk to you about looking at California from space. I'm not an astronaut, and I'm not even really a space nerd. I'm a geographer, though, so looking at satellite images of the Earth is not just my job. It's something that I absolutely love to do every day, and I feel incredibly lucky to be able to do it. I'm an X-Files fan, and I'm Agent Dana on Twitter, and I try to include a picture of Dana Scully in every one of my presentations. So I mentioned I'm a geographer. I've also worked as a Python programmer and a data analyst, but I like to launch things in the air. And even before I had this job at Planet, I did quite a bit of work with an open science, citizen science group called Public Lab, and would launch big balloons with cameras attached to them and take images of the Earth from about 300 feet up and then stitch them together. Really low budget, completely open source. And this was just something I kind of did on the side. And that desire to launch things runs in the family. That's my daughter launching a rocket, and she's joined me here today. I'm also a mom. All right, so when most people I talk to about Planet share with me what they know about the company, they talk about our small satellites, our microsats that we launch into space, and they're quite tiny. Relatively speaking, they're about a foot. And orders of magnitude less expensive than some of the giant satellites that, say, the government is launching or some other commercial satellite companies. So we're able to iterate, get different versions of these up into orbit, and improve the sensors over time. And for a while, we were sending them up to the International Space Station on rockets. You actually have to rent space on rockets when you want to launch things into space, which it kind of blows my mind. And when I first saw this, I thought it looked like the International Space Station was pooping out one of our rockets. And there's a child for scale to give you some sense of this. And we have quite a few satellites that are feeding data into our platform. So we have our own satellites, the ones that are made on the hardware side of the company. We call them doves, in part because the founders of the company are from NASA, and they wanted to imagine something that would be launched into space that wouldn't be for military purposes, so they called the satellites doves. We have other sensors from RapidEye, SkySat, and then we also have some of the free satellite imagery from Landsat and the European Space Agency. So they're all different types of sensors and different kinds of imagery. And for the most part, it's free. And there are a bunch of folks at Planet who worked really hard to release a lot of our imagery of California under a Creative Commons license. So quite a bit of it is available under a CC by SA 4.0 license. Sadly, I'm not on the hardware side of the company, even though I'm really excited about that. I work with software and data. So all that hardware stuff I just shared with you, someone had to teach me when I joined the company. What I really find interesting is how those satellites see the Earth, how they are able to sense the Earth, what kind of data they're able to capture, and then what we can do with it as humans. So this just gives you a little bit of information about what the sensors on those satellites see across the spectrum. So most of the imagery from our sensors that you might want to use is capturing data in the visible wavelength, but we also capture near infrared. And there are tons of things that you can do with that. And one thing that I'm particularly interested in is monitoring how vegetation changes across the Earth. So if you wanted to look at deforestation in the Amazon, or if you just wanted to look at farmland and crop health, or if you're interested in urban parks over time and the health of urban parks, there are ways to derive those kinds of health measures from the satellite imagery. So, one of the cool things about having all of this data coming from these different images is they're collecting imagery at different rates. There's a different cadence. So Landsat data, a government satellite program, is imaging the Earth monthly. A big reason Planet wanted to get so many of those tiny satellites up is because the goal was to image the entire Earth's landmass every day. That's where we're headed. And then some other satellites like our SkySat, are tasked, which means someone can tell them where to go. But the PlanetScope satellites are the most exciting. They are orbiting the Earth, capturing imagery of the entire Earth's landmass every day. So a lot of the developers that we work with outside of the company have to learn this entire language of how to work with this kind of data. It was useful coming into the company with a map-making background, a geography background, because the biggest challenge is you've got this image, and now you have to figure out how to make sure it's situated in the right place, the right latitude and the longitude, especially if you're going to put other data layers on top of it to use it. And all the data, of course, is raster, so it's stored in pixels, which is kind of another new data type for a lot of developers who want to come suck down our imagery. So this was really exciting for us. One of my colleagues put this together when the company first started a few years ago. Those PlanetScope satellites were only capturing a bit of imagery of the Earth, and now we've gotten to the point where we're capturing and publishing data from almost the entire globe. And this is the view of the world that I can kind of lose myself in for hours at a time. I have access to the fire hose of data internally, which is really exciting. We have some designer folks who clean things up and make things really pretty. So this is looking at deforestation, sugarcane fields. This is a volcano as it's starting to erupt. You can see the smoke plumes. This is capturing illegal mining in Peru. This is Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. The urban images are great. This is the Florida Keys. Maybe we all want to go there. And then here we go, San Francisco. So these static images are really gorgeous and exciting. But remember, we're capturing images daily, and that's the exciting part. Our resolution is 3 to 5 meters. There are definitely satellites out there that are capturing sub-meter, the ones that can actually identify things in maybe kind of frightening ways. But the idea with 3 to 5 meter resolution is that you can really get a sense of things that are changing over time. And I'm going to bombard you with animated Gifs if I can get them working. Yeah, let me see. Yeah, I'm not sure. Oh, I can. Just click in the middle of it, maybe. It's supposed to go automatically. Well, this is an animated GIF failure on my part. Oh, here we go. Let me go back. No, that's okay. All right, so we have these individual images. We have a team of folks who stitch them together to create these mosaics so that you can get these timely, monthly, weekly base maps of an entire area. And this is supposed to step you through month by month. And then here we have seasonal ones. But one thing we've been playing around with internally is just sucking in as many images as we can get for a certain geographic area, and then generating some animated GIFs just to show the change. And these are, in some cases, a few dozen images of the same area over time. This is maybe a little, folks who are used to seeing beautiful, perfect images from Google Earth look at some of the imperfections and are kind of maybe wondering what's going on. But it's that daily change. It's seeing such high cadence imagery over time. This is Yosemite. Wow. This is Lake Oroville when the dam overflowed. And I think it was back in February, people were pretty scared. And then, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get this to work, but this was just a little slider I made showing that particular dam before and after the flood. So, we've really been asking ourselves internally, what do people want to do with daily imagery of the entire Earth? I had to write this down. This is 150 million square kilometers a day captured by the sats. That's the Earth's entire landmass. So petabytes of data in the archive. Like, what kinds of questions can geographers, developers, environmental scientists ask and answer daily, mid-resolution imagery of the Earth? So I've started putting together some Jupyter notebooks where we've played around with some types of analyses that people could do, some fairly simple algorithms. There's a lot you can do with basic algebra, not necessarily machine learning. You'll definitely see some of those simple calculations in our notebook. But the idea is you try out things on a small amount of data, and then you figure out how to hook it up to the massive data archive so that you can apply it to a lot of data and ask some questions about change for the entire Earth. Thanks. I'll be around to answer questions after.
Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie. Here I am. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so grateful, first of all, that you would let someone from client services into your mix. I come from the project management world, so already, yay, one clap up front. Already, my brain is like out the side, like that gif from Sarah's presentation up front. I actually am traveled to be here. I'm come from Portland, come from the land northward. And there's some more claps. Okay, thank you. And I wanted to bring my daughter, Dana. I'm glad you did, but I figured wearing a 14-month-old on a front pack might be a little distracting. But I wish she were here. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'd be interested in seeing from the emails that get sent what new skills you have. So find me. I'm on Twitter, but that's more of like what TV teenager is the worst that there is. So there's a poll running right now if you want to vote for Maddie Conrad or Julie Taylor, if you know either of those two shows. If you don't follow me on Twitter. Okay, so I'm here to talk about post-project reviews, which most people call them postmortems. We decided at our agency a while ago that postmortems sound too much like the end, like a death. And sometimes with projects, we want to send them out on a Viking funeral, right? On a fiery, ship out to sea. But more often than not, there's so many learnings that we need to pick up. We need to understand. We need to take in these things that we learn. So I work at an 80-person agency in Portland. We're headquartered in Portland. We have an office in Boston. So I'm on the agency side of things. A lot of folks here that I've met and overheard talking to you guys are on the client side. But I still think that there's tons of opportunity within post-project reviews. Who here has been in a post-project review or postmortem in the last month? Perfect. How about the last 6 months? How about you talk about them, you want to have them, but you never have them? Okay. So we decided as an agency a couple of years ago that we really needed to double down on our efforts to get better and to get smarter. And so it was interesting when the call for speakers went out for this event. It was, what are you really passionate about? What are you really nerdy about? And for me, this is what I'm super enthusiastic about and super excited about. Not just because I'm from the project side and I'm process driven, but mostly because I'm really lazy. And lazy people, and I speak just not categorically for everyone, but just for myself, are always looking for smarter ways to do things so there's less time spent doing it. And so for me, this came in post-project reviews. And so we decided we wanted to put together a framework that could be used time and time again, regardless of what the project was, regardless of the budget size, regardless of anything about it. And we really decided that repeatability drives consistency. That when you have a framework set up, everybody knows what to expect, everybody can walk into a PPR ready to roll. And so I'm going to run you through our framework today. This is what I'm going to spend my time doing. This is what I'm really passionate about. So before a PPR happens, there are 3 things that we do at our agency. The first is we send out a survey to everybody on the project team. And it's the same 5 questions. So we start to gather a baseline of how we're feeling across the org about the projects that we run. The questions are, did the work output solve the right problem? Did the work exceed established success metrics? Does or will the work trigger a positive emotional response? Did the work from this project elevate our craft? Does the work from this project make you proud? And the last big one, are there issues or potential elephants in the room that really ought to be addressed? Right? When you get together with a group of your project peers, sometimes it's difficult to have these conversations. And so what we do is we send out the survey in advance so that the facilitator can read through all these responses and then pepper through either pull quotes or questions depending on kind of how the project went. Well, of course, we aspire to have teams that feel really comfortable talking to each other, but that's not always the case. And so having a setup like this allows our quieter team members to really have input and not let conversation be dominated by our chattier folks. Secondly, we do a kind of a project write-up, how we did, what the project was, the facts about it, our budgets, our spend, our actuals, effective bill rate. This is the project side of me coming out, and you guys are all glazed over, and that's okay. But this information is also really important to have, and it's important for the teams to know. And then lastly, we have an agenda. It's a repeatable agenda that happens on every one of our PPRs. We are 90 minutes long, and we have some ground rules. We'll run over those in a minute. And then I'm just basically going to talk through what that agenda is and how this might be useful for you. So we do a facilitated 90-minute session at the end of major phases in project work we do. We ask a facilitator who's familiar-ish with the project but not on the project team to come in and facilitate that effort. It allows them to be sort of a casual, nuanced bystander. Beforehand, when we had PMs running it, if you're PMing a project, it's really difficult to feel like you're kind of that neutral middleman when most PMs have really strong feelings about the way that projects have gone. Secondly, we have ground rules. These are the ones that at Connective DX, which is the agency that I work with, that we have decided are the most important. We have respect for each other. We have respect for the client. We have respect for the work. Secondly, we're in a judgment-free zone. That also means a sarcasm-free zone. And so we just try to level set when we start these post-project reviews to make sure everybody knows what to expect. And then own it. Own the good, the bad, the ugly, whatever happened. Commit to being better if you need to. So when we start a PPR, every person in that room goes around the table and indicates one bright spot from the project. And it's really fascinating to hear what people say. In some cases, they are highlighting a colleague. In some cases, they're highlighting something that went really well in the work, something that they're proud of. But it really helps set the tone for, you know what, even if this project was the worst one we ever had, there were bright spots and there were good things. And so it helps at least set the tone that, okay, some good did happen, and then let's dive into the nastiness. So really the guts of a post-project review for us, and this is where 60 to 70 minutes of time gets spent, is just this change and continue conversation. We just write it on the whiteboard, and it's just really kind of free-form discussion about what went well. What would we continue to do? If we were to do this project again, or we were to do something similar to it again, what would we continue? We'd continue having a small, closely knit cross-functional team. We would continue to be defensively communicating with the clients. We would continue to have off-site activities. And then changes, same thing. What didn't go so well? What would we change if we could do it all over again? And then there's also the idea of a parking lot, which in Portland most often gets called a bike rack, as you can imagine. and so you just write these up on the board. And it's fascinating to hear as people build off each other, and if there ever become kind of quiet moments in this facilitated discussion, it's the facilitator's job really to step in, ask questions, ask more probing questions, or to really pull quotes from the survey and to really force people to talk about things. And then the major activity coming out of this is you ask everybody in the room and or on the phone or remote or however it is to vote on which of these changes and continues are the most applicable to them or they think are the most important. And so really what we're trying to do is, because you talk about so much within this session, we're trying to identify what are the most consistent themes and patterns across all of the projects in our shop that give us an opportunity to change or to continue. And so typically you give anybody, you just decide how many votes each person gets, and you can vote from either the changes or continues. And so as the session ends, you kind of as a group have decided these are the top 3 to 5 biggest things that we would change or continue moving forward. And it's really fascinating because as we have watched this over the course of the last few years, we're really able to pinpoint these items that give us the opportunity to change. And what's so fascinating about this kind of this framework, this change continue framework, is our employees and our team members have started to take it outside of just post-project reviews for client work. One of my colleagues, our data and analytics lead, runs the search and rescue team in the Columbia River Gorge, and they use this framework after a search and rescue. They talk through, okay, what went well, what didn't go well, what should we do? I happen to teach a class at church sometimes, and I've used this framework after we talk about some big meaty topic. We say, okay, what have we learned today? What would we change about what we know? What do we continue, what would we continue in what we know? I sort of laughingly, I told my husband as I was preparing for this, we should have had one of these after my daughter was born. What would we change? What would we continue? And then the parking lot is like, do we want to do that again? Right? So there's just, it's this repeatable framework that gives us the ability to do things. And so lastly, really the kind of the takeaways from a PPR, as you close down the PPR, we ask everybody in the group to do 2 things. The first is to recognize a team member, someone on the team that did something that either made their life easier, that they respect, that they are appreciative for, and again, it just cultivates this really great sense of teammanship, which isn't a word, but it is now. And then, secondly, we also ask everyone around that table to make a commitment to change. What from the project would they, from their learnings on this project, what will they commit to change moving forward? Because ultimately, if we're not trying to get better, we're doing the same things over and over again, and that's not helpful. And then lastly, we publish out the notes on our internal intranet. We send them out to the project team, we send them to the management team, and then lastly, that gives us really a backlog of lessons learned over the course of time, and then it's my responsibility and a group of us on the process side to look at those on a quarterly, on a semi-annually basis, or any number of times, to find out really what are the things that the team members think that we need to change, what do we need to change. And so this has become this, it's like in our bedrock culture now to do post-project reviews, and it's been an amazing thing to twist and to see happen. And so I am super grateful to share this. If you're interested at all, I unfortunately can't stay for the Q&A, but if you're interested in any of this information or any examples of some of this stuff, please reach out to me and I'm happy to share it. My husband's a patent attorney and I asked him if it was patentable and he said only after 1 year. So we've been going longer than a year. So I'm happy to share. It's open source. So, all right. So thank you so much. So, Olivia.
Okay. The clicker. Okay. Sorry about technical difficulties, so bear with me. Well, I'm Olivia. Hi.
Hi.
Hello. It's a nice day. The carrots were yummy. Okay. So I'm Olivia, and I'm here to talk to you guys about big data. So there was another woman who came up and spoke about data, so shout out to you, data in the house tonight. All right. I'm just going to use the computer because this is a little weird. So whatever. All right, so my name's Olivia. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of California, Davis. I'm studying computer science, and I'm a Code 2040 fellow. So as a fellow this year, I completed an internship with Intel in Hillsborough. So yes, Oregon and the rain and the bikes, it's all true. And right now I'm an intern at Intuit, so I'm working on the categorizations team doing data analytics and machine learning. While I was at Intel, I was working on the platform architecture group, so it was like an internal tools group. And I want to talk to you guys about the project that I built there and some of the obstacles that I found in a big data project that was not classified as a big data project initially. So what is big data? Usually when you hear big data, you might see a picture like this, some graphs, and people just, they come with graphs, but like, what is it? Like, where did you get this information? That's what I wanted to know. I heard it a lot. And so what I found is any business, any company, there's a lot of different business units, right? You could think about legal, you might think about manufacturing or accounting, shipping, and the company keeps records on all of that data. It could be transactions or line items or like when something is being shipped, because all of that could contribute to the business basically making more money or not. Like if a company ships a lot of products on Friday, but then there's a lot of traffic on Friday, so it actually doesn't get to the consumer until Monday, but then Monday people don't like to shop, it could cause, like the company to lose more money. So those are things that I didn't really put together, and I didn't understand that the company has data, like that specific data, in a database somewhere, but no one's really looking at it because a lot of people don't think to ask those questions and like put those frameworks together, right? So it's really important to ask the questions. Like if you usually coming from the top at any company, someone will say like, oh, we want to make more money, and we want to make more money in this specific business unit, or we want to make more money with green buttons, so do that. And they'll go tell other people in the company like, go make more money with green buttons, so other people have to say, okay, so how do we make more money with green buttons? Do we have green buttons? Like, how many green buttons are we selling? Like, there's all of these things that you need to know. And when you have one question, it's important to keep going with that question. Like, analyze the question and then have another question. Like, never stop at one question. Like, the one question that you have is just the tip of the iceberg. And when you thought you were getting an answer, because you might ask someone a question and then get a response, it's still like, really keep questioning. I'll just leave it there for now, but we'll come back to that. Because during my internship, the company said, okay, we have this issue. There's one database inside the entire company, just one. The company's really, really cool. There's only one database. So they said, okay, we have this specific data in the database that no one's ever looked at. Ever. So we want you to go find this data in the database and tell us what the data means. As ambiguous as that sounds, that was my project. So we're talking about a company that is really, really old and has a lot of data, and the team that was asking me for this data, what they knew about the data is their team name. Like, we have a team named Cupcake. So in this database, go find every single table that is related to Cupcake. Let's break this down a little bit further, because I don't think you guys are with me. Cupcakes have frosting, right? We've got flour, salt, sugar. You have to go find all those ingredients in the database, like, just to get one cupcake. It is a lot of data. We're talking like, maybe like 150 tables that I had to find. No one knew the names of these tables. So it was a lot of digging. It was like one really hard problem that was broken down and down and down. It's like a scavenger hunt. You're like, okay, Mr. Database Manager, I need cupcake data. And he's like, I have a lot of cupcake data, like a lot of cupcake data. Which cupcake data do you need? How far back in the database do you want to go? Because I have cupcake data from forever. But if you want cupcake data that's 3 months old, we have this really fast query that you can use. You can get the data tomorrow. But if you want cupcake data that's 3 years old, you need to do like bit string manipulation. You need to go find like a hobbit in the corner, because like nobody has ever touch this data. Nobody knows how to access it. Like, it's going to be difficult for you. Like, this is like a sort of conversation that was happening. So it's a really hard problem that you start out with, but you break it down. And even when the database person might tell you, or anyone in your solution, in your journey for the answer says, I have this answer for you. And then you go validate that answer. You're like, he's like, the cupcake's over there. And then you go get the cupcake, right? And then you have the cupcake in your hand and you take a bite out of the cupcake. Is it really a cupcake? Is it, right? They tell you that it is, but sometimes it's not. It's like when you guys see this image, what do you see? What Nike, right? But what does Nike do? Athletics. They do a lot, right? Can you think of anything? Does anything stand out when you think of Nike? Shoes. Oh, thank you. Shoes, right? They sell shoes. So if Nike is thinking about data, they probably care about data related to shoes. I mean, there's a ton of questions that could come there, but when you're thinking about big data, Nike has a lot of data about shoes. They have a lot of data about the cushions and soles that make the shoes. They have a lot of data about how people use the shoes, the times of year that people buy shoes, like the Nike Free. When do people buy the Free more often? All of that stuff is actually really important, and the company has a lot of that data in the database. But there are not many data scientists who are going into the Nike database and gathering that data and using that data to actually make decisions and say, okay, like retailers, I want you to do this specific thing with the Nikes because we have data that says to do this, right? We need more people asking more questions and getting a lot more critical about the data in the database to make better business decisions. So hopefully some of you will do that in the future. But for me, what I started to understand is it really comes back to like financial statements, right? You start to think about like, how much money did this company bring in, right? We thought about Nike. We know that Nike sells shoes, and like it's like how many shoes did they really sell? Like how much money did they make selling shoes? And so you kind of check out the financial statements there to get that information. And even thinking about like an entire workflow, and how this one is not relative to Nike, but I did think that the design process here is very relative to the design process that I went through when designing my project, and even what I would think Nike would go through to design some sort of solution to bring in more money selling Nike Frees at a particular time of year, right? So it's kind of like you have an idea, and then you might go like, oh, okay, let me like ask a question about that idea and find some data related to that idea, and then go check on the data, do some analytics, perform some statistics on the data. So it's not a direct linear path. It's like very like flowy. So that's why I wanted you guys to like see that, just to know like it's never really like one particular question here and then one answer here. It's like very like flowing the entire time. So when we're thinking about like big data, and we know like the term big data now, it actually stemmed from a guy, Doug Cutting, and Google, because Google is the first company who really cared about big data because they wanted to like categorize everything in the World Wide Web, and that's like a huge problem, right? Like all the data like from forever, like that's a lot of data. And so when you're thinking about like big data, you usually think about Hadoop, and you think about MapReduce and HDFS, or the distributed file system. So yeah. And when you're thinking about like where that data is stored, the data is stored in a database. And it's sort of funny because like right here you have a picture of a database with many servers, and they're all like connected. And this is how ideally you think about a database, but that's not really how it is. Like the database that I worked with was this one server right there. So when you make a query that's like returns 1 billion records, that one server crashes. And then it all crashes. Like there's only one database. This is ideal. This is not reality. We also need people to design better database solutions, because that's not what it is right now. And even when you think about like inside the database, what does it look like? Well, this is like a very baby version of what a schema. So right here we have a schema, and these are basically tables and rows in the tables, right? But it might look like a lot if you're not that familiar with a database. This is actually like, maybe this is like 20 records. The database that I was working with was like 200,000 tables. 200,000 of those, right? And it's like someone tells you like, okay, so go in there and then find all the tables that say cupcake. And they don't just say cupcake, they're labeled like CP1234AZ2X5. So somehow you're supposed to know to find those and make some sense out of that. And even when you're talking about generating revenue, it's really important because all the data that's going to generate that revenue is in that database, and they're in those tables. And all of those columns or rows in each table, they might have really specific information about whatever item that you're looking for. And it could honestly make the company like a lot of money. For instance, the project that I was working on, we were trying to ask a question like, there's a particular piece that's being placed into many products that are being sold, right? And this is like across products. And if there's no need for this piece to be in production, we could take the piece out. And if that piece is not in production, that could save the company like a lot of money. So much money. So in the database, it would tell us like, oh, actually, when we're putting this into production, like, do we really need it there or not? And so project management is really, 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 really important in all of this. But I do want to break down project management from a project manager and then project management in terms of development. Because like in this case, like I was the developer and I had a project plan from a project manager. But I wasn't really able to follow that project plan because there were so many twists and turns that we didn't even account for. We thought the project plan, it looked something like this. Like it was like, okay, so we have this thing that we want to build here, and it should be really simple to build. It should take a week, and then you're going to get to this phase, and then this one, and then this one, and then you're done. It's very like linear. It's very clear. Everything's described like perfectly here, and this is actually what my project plan looked like. This is way more accurate. I mean, I ended my internship with, I think it was like 18 like notebooks full of like notes and iterations, and I think I never even got to phase 2 in the original project plan. It's just really interesting to see how like this, right, versus that. This is what development looks like in big data and data science. And so once you've kind of like, you've asked a question and you found some sort of solution that you're kind of like working toward, you can move your data. So my data initially was just stored in a regular relational database. And when I ran my query, I ended up making an API on that database to like return data because I asked all those questions and I found like a flow that I wanted to execute. So I run my query and I returned 1 billion records, 1 billion. Then my computer crashed, it stopped. I'd already ran it for 8 hours trying to just get these results. And it looked like when I talked to like the database manager about it, he's like, yeah, I think we've got like 17 billion more records in your query, but we couldn't get that far. So this was all in a regular relational database. So this is a big data problem. Clearly, right? It's like a lot of data for this really small question that the team had. But like we actually should have been in Hadoop. It's a big data problem, so we should have had like multiple clusters in racks and run the queries in batch. That's something that I know now after having an entire like day-long conversation with a data scientist. But it's something that a lot of teams don't think about. They'll give you a project and say, yeah, we have this database from forever. Go get the data, give us the data, tell us information about the data. But it's a big data problem. You actually need like big data solutions. It's not just like a regular like SQL relational database solution, right? So when you're working in Hadoop and you're working in big data, there's a lot of different like technology stacks that you can explore and start to like run on your data. You could use like However, you could use, it usually all runs on Hadoop at like the base layer, but you could use like Tableau for visualizations. Like right now, I'm working with Intuit. It's a fintech company, and so we use Tableau a lot to like start to make decisions about like how to change our categorization algorithms. So excuse me. And like we're using right now like a Vertica database. There's so many like different solutions and different ways that you can like put the like basically the apps on top of like Hadoop together to make some solution that you can gain meaning from your data. And there's just so many different ways to put it together. But I would like to point out that you basically have like Hadoop kind of like flowing through, even though other sides can be like different. And then I want to talk a little bit about like the analytics behind it, because it's not just like a word or just numbers. Like the questions are what are the most important. Like you're using the data to answer your questions, but the questions are what's important. Like when you're making these graphs, like what do those graphs mean? Like what are you trying to prove with those graphs? Like that's like the most important part. And you can prove that with a certain with a certain visualization. I'm not sure if anyone here has worked in D3, but there's so many different ways that you can visualize your data, like graphically, linearly. You can use like columnar data or whatever. There's so many like different ways. Sometimes like animations might be more appropriate for what you're building, but there's so many different ways. And if you choose the right one, you can really like get the answer that you found from your data. You can convey that to other business units who don't really understand the numbers. And that can really influence them to make better business decisions and really help your company in the long term. And I want to talk a little bit about effective communication, because it is like the biggest lesson that I learned from my internship. So the team that I was assigned to was not the team that I ended up working with. Like for my project, I didn't work with anyone on my team. I had one product owner who was on the database team, and I had another product owner who was on, he's an architect on another product team. And so I study software, and I worked with electrical engineers and a database manager, right? So I didn't really speak either of their languages. They were literally using terms I didn't know. They had a whole bunch of acronyms and very, very little time. They both had their own projects that they were working on, and mine was like at the bottom of the totem pole. And so one thing that I noticed is when I would come and have a meeting with either of the product owners, they were listening to me and they were responding to the questions that I had. So it was really important that I did my research and I understood like, okay, so this is what I'm thinking about. Here's the solution that I'm proposing to bring to the table. What do you think about that? And wait for their response. But not just like accept their response and walk away, but to really start to engage and have a conversation about it. Because one thing that I let happen for too long was to get a response from a product owner, accept the response and walk away, when the product owner would come back the next day and say, actually, I was tired that day. What I told you is totally false. That information makes no sense anymore. And if I would have just like engaged with them a little bit more at that time and said, oh, like, what do you mean by that? How do you actually apply that? Where do you see that in the database? You said that this query would work. Would you show me right now? If I would have done that at that moment, it would have saved me maybe like 2 weeks after each question, just because I spent so much time trying to understand what he said or what was said to me, and as opposed to like having direct conversation about it. So it's really, really important. I would advise you to like, if you have any sort of question about any product that you're working on, like don't be afraid to like go for it and ask the question, because people always say that there's no dumb question, but also like when you don't ask the question, or even if you don't ask enough questions, people might know the information that they're telling you is wrong, but since you don't know, they don't know. They're not going to be like, oh yeah. They're just like, she doesn't know, so just go ahead. That's it. Thank you.
the stand. How's everyone doing? Good. Okay, I should introduce myself. Thank you. My name is Matt. I work here at Square. I think that's good. You guys hear me?
Yes. Yes.
And it's really great to see a lot of familiar faces. So thank you, and hopefully meet some new ones today as well. So the title of my talk is Being Transgender in Tech. You're probably wondering why a white guy is presenting at a talk focusing on marginalized folks. Although on the outside, I may look like any other guy, I guess the title of my talk has ruined any guessing game that could have occurred. I identify as a transgender man. I was assigned female at birth and have since transitioned to male. I thought a lot about speaking today, how it made me nervous, how it would out me at work, and how it's deeply personal. All these fears are real, but what's more important than my personal fears is the bigger picture, that trans voices are heard. I want to define a couple terms before this talk. Transgender is a person whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with their birth sex. Cisgender, a person whose sense of personal identity and gender corresponds with their birth sex. It's vital to give trans and gender nonconforming folks a voice so that we can continue to create change and embrace diversity in a world that tells us that trans people shouldn't exist. In my reality, I have a choice and a privilege if I want to be out. I walk down the street and no one would ever know my past. That being said, my choice to be out is for a few reasons. I'll note a couple. Number one, it creates change and exposure that trans people exist and we're here. Number two, it gives me back the power. What I mean by this is that now no one has the power over me to out me. I've outed myself. I regain that power to therefore own my trans identity. I think being out isn't so foreign, even if you're not LGBT. I think we can all relate to coming out as something. We all have a past, and some of our pasts are worn on our sleeves and some aren't. The best way I describe my life is like I've lived multiple lives in one lifetime. I've always been me, but I've been able to get a glimpse of what it's like to be seen as other identities. I'm going to share a few stories about tech and being trans. When I was transitioning at my previous employment, the director of sales was a gender nonconforming individual. They were probably one of my biggest allies, amongst a few other straight allies. I think it's important to note that if you don't see it, it's hard to be it. Seeing someone who I could identify with in a position of power was really impactful for me. It made me feel like I could also achieve my goals, and most importantly, not limit myself. The power of visibility helped empower me to feel like I could still be myself and achieve greatness if I wanted to. Before I interviewed at Square, a friend of mine, Caitlin, posted a photo on her social media of the bathrooms at Square. Has everyone maybe seen the bathrooms or used the bathroom? Okay, well, check them out. Seeing the signs and the proactive inclusivity made me intrigued even further about applying, and eventually I did. I think at first glance, most people wouldn't think that those signs would affect me, but they do. For trans people, bathrooms can be a major source of anxiety and stress because they make people choose a box. When you're in the midst of a transition, like I was at my previous employment, I didn't really have a box. Maybe I'll never fit into a box, neatly packaged and tied with a bow, even present day. When I was transitioning in my early 20s, bathrooms were scary. I was going by male pronouns, but wasn't on testosterone yet. Unfortunately, some people didn't respect my pronouns, since what they saw on the outside wasn't how society has taught us a man should look like. I would go into the women's room at first for many reasons. It's not that I felt unsafe at work going to the men's room, but I didn't feel like I looked male enough. to use the men's room. As I started to take testosterone, I would go to different floors of the office to use the restroom. I didn't want people to think I was female because I was still using the women's room. The solution in my mind was to use bathrooms on different floors, since there was no gender-neutral option or inclusive signage that made me feel comfortable like we have at Square. I didn't want people to start talking about me behind my back. Sometimes I would leave the building just so I could find a single-stall bathroom. This affected my work in a few ways. As you can imagine, it was physically time-consuming to not use the bathroom on my floor. It also affected my health since I wasn't drinking much water throughout the day, since that meant using the restroom. And mentally, keeping tabs on my liquid consumption and whether it was worth it or not to drink this beverage or not was really exhausting and mentally just got me away from my actual job. On the brighter side, I met a lot of new people in the office that I normally wouldn't have met since I was going to different floors all the time. It was like taking a tour all the time. That's how I became friends with one of the best sales reps, and so that's a win. The reason why I share this information is to provide insight to the implications of the boxes and binary spaces trans people encounter in the workplace and in life, whether that's bathrooms or locker rooms, etc. Another story I'm going to share is transitioning on the phone in tech sales. At my previous employment, I also did phone sales. As my voice became deeper, I noticed a different tone on the other end. I was now called boss, man, bro, guy, and I needed to make the internal switch to now talk bro. It's interesting to think about when to make that switch and philosophically where the lines are in the gendered world that we live in. I guess I was starting to sound male now. I was in sales, and so the last thing I wanted to do was to make someone feel like we didn't have rapport. So bro talk, I had to learn. Again, I wasn't socialized as male, so this language needed some practice, and I had to be my own Rosetta Stone. You can laugh at that. Pre-testosterone, some business owners would try to flirt with me on the phone, which was interesting. Testosterone expands your vocal cords, so that's why my voice is deeper now. Probably in their mind, I was some hot woman on the other line, who knows. But now the decision makers were straight shooters who wanted to just get down to business. Again, this wasn't every male interaction, but definitely enough to be noteworthy. After taking a month off for medical leave, I changed my name at work. I used to go by the name Jay since it was gender neutral. Going by Jay at first was the right decision, since I know that if I started with Matthew right off the bat, I probably would have confused 99% of my merchants, since again, when I started on the phone, my voice was pretty high. When I did change my name to Matthew, I told my accounts that my name Jay was actually my middle name. And most people didn't question it, but there were a few interesting exceptions that we could talk about later. As you might know with sales, sometimes old accounts from your past reemerge. Now that my voice was different and my name changed on my email, most people thought I was a different sales rep. This worked to my advantage with a couple accounts, since when I spoke with the very same decision maker, they now told me some of the real objections and the reasons why they didn't sign up with Jay. Obviously, it was the same person. They were talking to me the whole time. But I just nodded and said, okay, interesting. It's like acting. I was also learning about space and what that meant to be able to take up space. I remember one interaction at a bar when I was newly transitioning. A man started walking towards me and my friend. I immediately got out of the way to give him space at the bar because he was coming into my space and the bar was crowded. My friend, who's also a trans man, immediately told me in a stern voice, "Don't ever do that again." What he was telling me was a bigger lesson. People socialized as women, whether we're talking about cisgendered women or trans men, have been taught a few things by our society. Some of these things are to move out of the way or apologize instead of just saying, "excuse me," and essentially try to shrink sometimes to be smaller and to make room. At least that's true from my experience. Relating to tech, on the phone, space meant I could leave gaps in the conversation without fear that I would get interrupted. Sure, there was always going to be that person on the phone or on the conference call interrupting everybody. But overall, the ability for me to take up space changed in my favor. The topic of physical and non-physical space is important to talk about, as it can help create awareness in how we interact in meetings, in work, and in life. The more proactive our allies can be, the better, for any community to create a positive change. Depending on where you're from, you may not be familiar with the trans process. And here are a few ways to support your family, friends, and coworkers. Number one, ask about pronouns. If you don't know, just ask. It's better than to assume. Number two, when someone tells you their preferred name and their pronoun, respect it and don't challenge it. Remember that they know best. Number three, offer to accompany someone to the restroom if it's early on in their transition. I know that this is obviously case-by-case basis, but for me, I went into the women's room in the morning and then the men's room in the afternoon of the same day. So making that giant leap from like the women's room to the men's room was super scary. And I think if I had more male allies to support me, maybe that would have been a little easier. Number four, never out someone without their consent. This is huge. Just because you know that they might be trans and maybe they're even out doesn't mean it's okay to tell others without asking first. Not only can this make a trans person feel uncomfortable, but this can potentially put them in an unsafe and dangerous situation. And five, avoid making someone feel like a token. Respect personal boundaries and avoid the "I'm just curious" questions. Sometimes it's better to just Google it. That's a personal boundary I'm working on. All right. Laverne Cox, who is a trans woman of color who I really admire, quotes this idea really nicely. And she says, "The preoccupation with transition and with surgery objectifies trans people, and then we don't get to deal with the real lived experiences. The reality of trans people's lives is that so often we're targets of violence. We experience discrimination disproportionately to the rest of the community. When we focus on transition, we don't actually get to talk about those things." So I want to end it here and note that my experience as a white Jewish trans man has been faced with certain difficulties. That being said, in our community, trans women of color are the most targeted for discrimination and violence. And it's vital that as people and allies, we continue to raise awareness to help keep each other safe and contribute to making this world a more tolerant place. Thank you.
So we're just going to do a Q&A. So if we could get all the speakers to come back up to the front. Anyone have questions? Anybody?
Marie.
Should I just... I can talk loud.
Yeah.
Talk loud. Okay, so this is, oh no, Olivia's not here. Oh, it's two questions. Oh. Okay, never mind. So. Okay, I guess she had to head out early.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't really remember people's names, but the question is about the startup with antiques. I'm really curious if you can talk a little bit about kind of deciding to transition the project from being fun to being a startup, kind of how you convinced your roommate to do it and what was involved in the decision, and from a personal and financial point of view, whatever you can share.
Yeah, sure. So my co-founder is also my wife, not my roommate. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that. Yeah. So it took a lot of energy because she's a really personal person. Like, I don't think she has any social media accounts. Like, so she was like, I don't want to do this. Like, so it took a lot of convincing, and I was reading a lot of startup related stuff. And I just kind of kept up bringing it up when we were driving, we were like at restaurants, everywhere. Yeah. And you would be surprised if you just keep, if you're persistent enough, I think it helps. And you kind of have to trick them into like believing, Yeah. I was like, just imagine this is what happens, and then we have these customers, and then imagine it as a big company. You have to kind of paint that picture. And I think what happened is she started using it as a user herself. It was completely, there was no login or anything. It was just herself. It was in the home server. So she has a server for herself at home. And so she kind of fell sick. I think I missed this point in the talk, unfortunately. So she fell sick and she was kind of off work for 2 weeks. And she kind of started refining it as a developer. So she developed it. She used it as a user for 5 months. And I kind of lost interest because she just wasn't getting convinced. So I just kind of went and did my own stuff. And then she started refining it and she started realizing that it's really cool. I think she saw the voice. I think my voice was in her head. Yeah. And then she's like, okay, let's do it. And you won't believe, I was like, no, now I'm not interested. Like, that really happened. It took like a week or two for her to convince me that, okay, I'm really serious about this. So financially, so right now I'm working full time on it, but she has a day job. So she's a computer systems. So she's a computer systems engineer at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So that's how we are managing financially right now. Am I missing any other? Is that okay? Yeah. So just be persistent, I would say, and just kind of trick them into yeah. I think that works. Yeah.
Can I say something? So I'm Samantha. Can I come up?
Yeah. This is Samantha.
Hi everyone. I just wanted to say that. That actually, so I develop every day, and so I really, as she kind of alluded to earlier, I really didn't want to actually develop something for my own. So it was just in a spreadsheet, and it had its limitations, and then have like an Access FileMaker thing, and this isn't going anywhere. So finally drug myself to actually, I'm just going to write this, so it does what I want. But then. The nice part is that it's closed and no one else could see it, so I could do anything I wanted. If I wanted to copy and paste from a site just to store that history of someone, no problem. If I wanted to take a photo of someone and just store it in the database, that wasn't an issue. So it was kind of a challenge, as she mentioned, getting it prepared to make it public, because it's a very different kind of thing when you're going live. And so the biggest thing, technically, is that, it was actually not as difficult as I imagined on the technical side. Yes, moving into AWS versus some monolith kind of system where database, web server, and everything's on one, that's kind of one thing. But I added a single column to one of our main tables as just an owner ID for these things, and that magically made it pretty scalable so that we could store stuff for other users, and then we built out a large AWS infrastructure for it. But it was definitely the content side that actually was the more difficult end.
One more point. So even with
Yes.
last point. So it's even difficult to convince her because she's doing the development side of the things. I'm an electrical engineer, but I don't develop computers. I don't do a lot of programming. So even now, when I come across a UI related stuff, and I tell her I don't think this would be a smooth experience. You need to change this. It doesn't work all the time. So what I do is I go on YouTube, I find out some big person saying that, maybe the co-founder of some big company, and then I make her watch those videos. Hey, do you want to watch this? And then that point comes up, and then she's like, okay, I think we need to do that. So I convince her through some other people. So that really works. Yeah.
The one, okay. The one other thing that was just kind of interesting in the development is that, I don't know, I'm sure others have experienced this in many teams and stuff. It's probably similar and a little funny being spouses on this, but it's She's working on the non-technical side, which there's a lot to do on that end as well. But I feel I'm just, I have my day job and I come home, work on this, and it's just like sometimes you slog away, especially like, I don't know, I love the back end a little bit more. The front end, just things start to get really messy and it's really hard. You have to develop for a million different devices and there's lots of little problems that crop up, but it's like you work hard on this thing for like 2 weeks and you come and you're like, okay, what do you think? And it's like the smallest problem, but it's like, well, this just, no, go back to the drawing board. It's like, God, I just put in weeks worth of effort and it's just this one little niggling problem. But it's been fun working together on this stuff. Other questions?
I had a question for, I forgot your name, the one you work at Planet? Dana. Yeah. Yes, Dana. You have a lot of experience with all these satellite images and a lot of background in that kind of stuff. What questions are you most excited to answer with this huge amount of data that's coming in from the planet every day?
You know, so we have a lot of folks who are looking at agricultural areas, wanting to derive vegetation indices from the imagery to just look at crop health from week to week or month to month. I mean, those are probably some of the most practical commercial applications. You know, I think I'm trying to come up with some good examples of looking at urban change. It's 3 to 5 meter resolution, so you know it's a little coarser than data you might want to see, you know, row home to row home in, say, Philadelphia, where I'm from. But you can look at really interesting spatial patterns, and it's that daily imagery that I think would allow me to see how parks are changing, you know, or even some kind of slightly larger scale human activity in urban areas. And so that's my particular interest, but, you know, it's really kind of amazing the kinds of environmental change that you can see before and after natural disasters. Shocking, heartbreaking, and so the founders of the company have made an effort to release a lot of that data to humanitarian groups who might need to go in and do a rescue after an earthquake. But you know, even some things that are happening in, say, Syria, you can actually see migration of refugee groups because there are so many people, or you can see some of the tents growing day by day by day in some of those areas. So sometimes I in my dark moments joke that it's sort of like a front row seat to the end of the world. But you know, there's a lot of hope. There are a lot of really, really beautiful things about global change that we can see in that imagery. So that was kind of a vague answer to your question, but it is challenging to just imagine what you might do with all of the data.
I'll go. You next? Oh, okay. I'll talk loudly. So I would like to hear from each of you what you would like to see tech companies, this company in particular, other companies do to create more inclusive environments for underrepresented populations in tech. We can just start at the end.
I think creating as much education as possible. I'm really a believer in exposure and education. The more trainings that you can do, like maybe the first week someone's hired, the more education that's out there that you put out in front of someone, I think, can enable change. So.
I'm going to approach this question, I think, from the area that's dearest to my heart, which is the security field. In terms of security is one of the computer science fields which has the lowest amount of like gender diversity. I think one of the things that we can try and do is create events that, I guess, there's a lot of, I guess, situations where like there are competitions or just the field seems very intimidating, and if we can somehow create a more inclusive space. Actually, I'm trying to do this right now. I haven't fully announced this yet, but the Grace Hopper conference in October, Square is going to try and host the CTF, which is a security competition. it will be like a women-only security competition, which I don't think has really been done on a wide scale before. But like that's I think one way we can try and do it is have more events that are inclusive like this.
I think having more events like these, I think that every company could have more of these. I read something interesting that there should be like a female-only YC, like Y Combinator just for female. But I don't know if like that's going to happen. But yeah, I think more events would help. Yeah.
I think that mentoring women is a good place to start, and I can say just from like our startup right now, it's 100% lesbian. I'm at this point considering it's the two of us, so we're very diverse at this point, so, interracial. Actually, so you may have heard that my day job, I work at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and you know something that it was only like 2 weeks ago that I was digging through because I have this fascination with kind of like myself, 50s and 60s and kind of like mid-century times. And so our institution goes back to the 1940s. And so I was just sitting there browsing like our archives, which there's just, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of images. And so I was just typing in, like there's all these famous pictures, like working at a company that you're familiar with, I'm sure with Square, like some of these like prototype images and stuff. And so we have our own. And there's like most of the 5,000 people we work with, they're familiar with these. But I was just going like year to year. I typed 1939, enter. And I watched, read through all that, or looked through them all. And so I found all these amazing like women scientists back in like the 50s and 60s. And I'd love to highlight them. Like this was just something that came up the other day, but it was like really amazing to see that there was a lot more representation than I expected, to be honest. And so hopefully stories can come out about that at some point.
I'm not sure. I can talk about my experience and what's been helpful for me. You know, I work for a company that has a number of remote employees, and so that kind of flexibility is pretty incredible. I definitely work a lot. Do I work a lot? Yeah. but I have some flexibility with my hours, which makes it possible to be, you know, a decent parent. I'm also the breadwinner in the family, so you know, I just think having opportunities for women, underrepresented folks as they get older too. I turned 41 this year, and I feel ancient in tech. I don't think I'm ancient, but you know, it's especially when you come to San Francisco a lot for work, it feels that way. Planet has a decent amount of age diversity, so that makes it feel pretty good to me. My team, the public API team, is maybe age 35 to 45. Most people have kids, so we're 80% remote, so we're very respectful of each other's time. People work a lot. It's often asynchronous. Stuff gets done, but it makes life possible. You know, and not a lot of tech companies do that, but I think the men on the team appreciate it just as much as the women do. But I don't know. I mean, I look out, I don't see too many people like me 5 years ahead, 10 years ahead, and I want to remain an individual contributor. It's kind of hard to see the path. But that's part of the reason why I'm staying in tech. I've thought about leaving. So maybe someone who's 25 thinks when I'm really old at 41 and have a kid, I can still be an individual contributor.
Thank you. Oh, it's me. I had a question for both Dana and Sarah. So it sounds like you both have a lot of really interesting data, whether it's about geographical data like visualization or looking at the traffic between services. So when you have that much data and you're trying to get an interesting question out of it, how do you even go about deciding what question you want to ask that you might get an answer out of?
I'll answer quickly. So we're kind of doing a lot of experimental stuff in Jupyter notebooks. That's just a tool that a lot of teams, engineering teams in my company have chosen. Most of us are Python developers. And it's been a really ideal way for us to ask some interesting questions or implement some interesting algorithms on small bits of data. But all the tooling is in place so that we could potentially scale those ideas and ask them across many geographic areas, or go back in time and look through the stacks of data asking those questions. So we definitely start small with just the notebook and some algorithms and sharing those and testing it.
I guess the interesting thing about particularly what the thing I presented today was that service or that kind of visualization spawned out of a totally different question, which was when I started at Square, my manager came up to me and said, if we wanted to build something that kind of manage all of the sensitive information, or like if you could somehow figure out like how to gate particularly sensitive information in some way, how would we go about doing that? And I was like, I just got hired. I have no idea where to start. And so it kind of was like I basically had to step back and say, okay, what is the big question we're trying to answer? And the big question we were trying to answer is, where does that data live? Okay, how are we going to answer that question? And just consistently breaking it down to like, okay, we need access to this kind of data. Where is it being stored right now? I think a big challenge when you work in security or in an infrastructure kind of role or in a back-end role is you have all of these questions and you realize I can't use any of the tools because I don't know how to do UI at all. So like it was a struggle. I built an initial visualization using d3.js and I was like, things are bouncing everywhere and I have no idea how to fix it. It was only when Netflix came out with their UI thing, I was like, oh cool, someone's already built this. I just need to format the data I want into the data format they want. And then from there, it's now figuring out like, we've answered the base question, what other questions do we want to answer based on that? How do we build tools for that? And I think another big challenge is, okay, how do we convince people that this is a good idea? It's steady work. The work is not done. Work in progress.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great answer. And I think for me, coming from a geography background, map making background, having some way to visualize the data, or maybe just a portion of the data, can give you ideas or opens up possibility for all kinds of questions that you might ask of the larger data set. And so I showed you a bunch of those little animated Gifs, right? And that's just like a subset of the data, but the human brain is really able to process a lot. You can really kind of imagine all the change you might be able to see or to quantify or measure, even if you were working with much larger data sets. So yeah, visualizations are really, really help.
I have a question for Matt. Thank you so much for your story. It was really great to hear. I'm particularly interested in when you were talking about the differences in the way that people treated you before and after your transition. Do you have like more, anything more to say about like either the space issue or other ways in which you were treated differently? And like, as someone who has been perceived as in both of those gender roles, do you have any advice for women that want to be able to take up that space?
Yeah. Today, I'm still working on it. That's a great question. I'm still working on taking up space. I think I'm always trying to recondition myself. Today, actually, I was waiting for the BART, and I saw someone walking towards me, and I was in the proper area where you should wait when you're waiting for the BART, not in the yellow. And the guy walked right into me, and I could see him walking towards me, and I'm really happy that I didn't move. It sounds weird. Like, I'm happy that he bumped into me, but I didn't need to move, And I think if you are okay getting bumped into, I think, it's what's important to you. And I think that's the deeper thing, obviously, is that don't be afraid to take up space. I think that's a lot of the game, is that if someone does interrupt you, I think creating those boundaries and saying, actually, I wasn't done speaking. And I think I'm always trying to figure out, I was taught growing up, like, don't make waves, you know, like I was like, be nice, you know, maybe don't make conflict. And maybe a lot of cisgender women can relate to that. And I think I'm always trying to figure out when it's okay and I'm just standing up for myself and I'm not being an asshole. And maybe sometimes you have to, I mean, can I say that? I mean, sometimes you have to be that because it's important to stand up for yourself. I think that would be the advice I would give, is that you should always stand up for yourself. And for women, I think you have to do it twice as hard. So I guess that would be the glimpse. What was the first part of that question? Yeah.
Like,
other things to share. I mean, I think, man, you know, I think like I really feel like I have lived many lives, because at one point in my life, I actually identified as a straight woman, and I had long hair. And then at one point, I identified as a lesbian, and I had short hair. And then at another point in my life, I identified as genderqueer, which, if you guys don't know what that term is, it means you don't really identify with one gender or another. And I think making the switch from transitioning from pre-testosterone, where I had, you know, hairy legs, a really round face, I like bound my chest down. It was really interesting because I noticed that people didn't really ask me as many questions as they do these days. Like, people ask me for directions all the time. I'm so bad at directions. But it's really interesting, just, I guess, these small little things that the nuances that I notice now of like, do I look more trustworthy because I'm fitting these norms? Apparently I do, you know, which is sad. And which is why like I want to talk about this, because just because you fit into a box doesn't mean that you should be taken more seriously. So maybe that's the answer. Thanks for asking.
Can I add a piece about taking up space? As a cisgendered woman, I ask myself what I'm afraid of. And if it's for my safety, that's one thing. But if it's about disapproval, that's very different. And self-examination and asking me why I'm afraid helps me take up a lot more space. And it also helps to work here in a supportive environment where it is actively encouraged for people from underrepresented groups and technology to take up more space.
Any other questions?
I can ask another one.
Yeah.
Matt, this is for you as well. What is something, if you had to pick one part of your experience that you think that the next generation of trans kids may not have as difficult of a time dealing with? So something that you either see slowly improving or something that you feel is really, really, really important to change?
I think the ability to live in the gray. I think it's really amazing to see that there is more awareness around the spectrum, and not only of sexual orientation being a spectrum, but gender identity being a spectrum. That you don't have to fit into a box, and I really love seeing more people challenge that we're just humans, and maybe we weren't ever supposed to fit into a box because we're more complex than that. Let's give ourselves more credit. So it's really nice to see those gray areas.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Stay and mingle, eat more food.
Is that possible or no? Too late? Oh, yeah.